July 14, 1944, near Saint-Lô, France. On a summer day in Normandy, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley stood with folded arms as a modified Sherman tank reversed from a thick hedgerow that had stalled U.S. forces for weeks. A handful of officers gathered nearby, among them Major General Leonard Garrow and several ordnance specialists called in to observe a test that might either solve a critical problem or prove useless. Bolted to the tank's front were 4 heavy steel teeth projecting forward, an attachment so straightforward that Bradley had originally dismissed the report describing it. Yet the situation in Normandy had grown desperate enough that even simple ideas deserved a trial. The success of the Allied breakout depended on it. The engine roared, gears engaged, and the tank rolled toward the ancient earthen barrier. As it accelerated, the metal prongs slammed into the base of the hedgerow with a ripping sound. Soil and roots burst upward. Instead of climbing the obstacle or exposing its underside to enemy fire, the tank pushed straight through. The blades sliced into the packed earth like cutting tools through fabric. Within seconds, the vehicle emerged on the far side, branches and debris trailing behind, but otherwise unharmed. Officers watching nearby cheered, while technicians rushed forward to inspect the breach and check for damage. Bradley remained quiet, already weighing the broader implications. If the device proved dependable and could be produced quickly, it might provide the key to ending the stalemate. Turning to his chief ordnance officer, Lieutenant Colonel John Medeiros, Bradley ordered immediate production to bog down the entire invasion. For 6 weeks, Allied troops had struggled to advance through the dense Norman countryside. The region's hedgerows, ancient field boundaries, had proven more difficult to overcome than concrete bunkers or minefields. Ironically, the man behind the solution was not a senior engineer or veteran strategist, but a young sergeant from New Jersey named Curtis Culin. Using scrap metal from German beach obstacles and a welding torch, he devised a simple attachment that allowed tanks to punch through the barriers instead of climbing over them. His improvised design would soon be fitted across Allied armored units, helping to open the path out of Normandy. Meanwhile, at headquarters in southern England, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower studied maps that revealed troubling news. It was mid-June 1944, days after the D-Day landings. The amphibious assault had succeeded in establishing a foothold on the French coast. Despite severe losses, especially on Omaha Beach, more than 150,000 Allied troops had come ashore on June 6 alone. Within a week, the number had doubled, and a continuous beachhead stretched across dozens of miles. Hitler's Atlantic Wall had been breached. Yet progress inland was far slower than planned. By mid-June, Allied forces controlled a shallow strip of territory. Over 1 million soldiers had landed, but they were confined to a narrow coastal zone. Casualties mounted daily, and the rapid advance envisioned in pre-invasion planning had stalled. The strategy had called for swift movement into open terrain. British and Canadian units were to seize key transport hubs, while American forces would capture Cherbourg and then drive south and west. On June 7, just a day after the landings, American infantry moving inland encountered terrain unlike anything they had trained for. Exhausted from the beach assault, they expected scattered resistance. Instead, they entered a landscape that strongly favored defenders. Narrow lanes, high banks, and dense vegetation created a natural maze. Soldiers soon realized these were not ordinary hedges. Over centuries, farmers had cleared stones from their fields and piled them along property lines. Earth accumulated around these piles and plants took root. Trees and shrubs grew on top, their roots reinforcing the embankments. By 1944, many of these boundaries stood several feet high and thick, with dense vegetation rising far above. The soil had hardened over generations, forming natural walls strengthened by deep root systems. To attacking troops, each hedgerow became a fortified position, concealing German defenders and blocking vehicles. What had once been simple agricultural boundaries now functioned as formidable defensive structures. Breaking through this terrain required more than courage and firepower. It demanded adaptation. The welded steel prongs attached to American tanks, born from improvisation, provided exactly that. Within weeks, the new equipment allowed armored units to smash through the hedgerows rather than climb over them, preserving momentum and reducing exposure to enemy fire. This practical innovation helped transform a stagnant front into a renewed offensive, enabling Allied forces to push out of Normandy and begin their advance towards Germany. After centuries of growth, the hedgerows of Normandy had fused into dense barriers of roots, soil, or triangular, but most measured roughly 200 to 400 yards across. The irregular layout was the result of 1,000 years of land inheritance, farming traditions, and property divisions. Reconnaissance photographs taken before the Allied landings revealed just how extensive the terrain was. Intelligence officers saw the patchwork of fields but did not fully grasp its tactical consequences. One aerial image of only 8 square miles near St. Lo showed nearly 4,000 hedgerow-enclosed plots. Each of these enclosures could serve as a miniature stronghold. Across the American sector, from the coastline to the base of the Cottontaine Peninsula and south towards St. Lo, the hedgerows formed countless natural defensive positions. For German troops, these barriers were superior to anything engineers could quickly build. Machine gun crews dug shallow firing points into the earthen banks, leaving only small openings for their weapons. These positions were almost impossible to detect until they fired. The thick soil shielded them from artillery fragments, and the dense foliage concealed them from aircraft overhead. From above, spotter planes saw only a continuous green canopy. A soldier crouched behind one of these embankments was often better protected than inside a concrete bunker, since bunkers could be located and targeted, while hedgerow positions remained hidden. Even a single German squad with a machine gun and rifles could dominate an entire field, holding off far larger American units for extended periods. German defenses did not rely on unbroken lines. Instead, small groups were scattered throughout the bocage landscape, creating overlapping fields of fire. Infantry moving between hedgerows had almost no protection. Norman fields offered little cover, no rocks, trees, or depressions. German gunners had already calculated distances and prepared their weapons for likely crossing points. The moment American soldiers stepped into the open, they were met with pre-planned fire. Approaching the next hedgerow meant traversing zones where German machine gunners simply fired at fixed coordinates. Sunken lanes connecting the fields were just as dangerous. These narrow paths, carved deep by centuries of traffic, were obvious avenues of advance and therefore prime sites for ambush. Obstacles such as felled trees or rubble blocked the routes, while concealed machine guns covered them. A single weapon could halt an entire platoon. American armored units faced similar problems. The M4 Sherman tank was reliable, widely produced, and capable of defeating German armor under normal conditions. Yet in the bocage it lost much of its effectiveness. The thick earthen banks, reinforced by roots, could not be breached easily. Tank guns might blast away foliage, but the underlying barrier remained intact. Some crews attempted to ram the hedges at speed, hoping to break through or climb over them. This proved extremely dangerous. As a Sherman rode up the bank, its front lifted and exposed the underside of the vehicle, protected by only about an inch of armor. German infantry, equipped with handheld anti-tank weapons, waited for that moment. When the tank's belly became visible, they fired. The shaped charge rockets easily penetrated the thin armor, often destroying the vehicle with a single shot. Charges withdraw and detonate them, a process that took time and exposed them to danger. The resulting explosion also alerted German units across the countryside, allowing them to concentrate fire on the newly created gap. Tanks and infantry moving through these narrow openings were funneled into predictable kill zones. Specialized vehicles equipped with bulldozer blades were introduced to push through the obstacles. In theory, they could carve paths for following forces. In practice, they became obvious and vulnerable targets. Slower and less maneuverable than standard tanks, they drew immediate attention from German anti-tank gunners. Many were destroyed within weeks, leaving few available for regular operations. By late June 1944, 6 weeks after the Normandy landings, the American advance had slowed dramatically. Progress was measured in yards rather than miles. Casualties mounted at an alarming rate. U.S. Army records indicate that one corps suffered more than 10,000 losses while advancing only about 7 miles through the bocage. Some estimates suggested that certain sectors experienced losses approaching 1,000 men per kilometer. Although exact figures vary, the scale of the fighting rivaled the attritional battles of the First World War. Capturing key terrain such as Hill 314 near the Cotentin Peninsula cost thousands of casualties. Infantry divisions that had landed on D-Day saw their frontline strength reduced drastically within weeks. Companies that began with around 150 soldiers were often reduced to a few dozen. The campaign in Normandy was supposed to become a rapid, mobile breakout once the beaches were secured. General Omar Bradley, commanding U.S. First Army, faced a serious operational crisis. His forces were exhausted and suffering losses that threatened the broader Allied plan. British and Canadian troops to the east, fighting around Caen, were also making slow progress against determined German defenses. The original timetable for capturing the city slipped by weeks. What had been planned as a swift campaign across France risked turning into a prolonged, grinding struggle, resembling the static warfare of an earlier generation. Major General Walter Bedell Smith, who served as Omar Bradley's chief of staff and had previously held the same role for Dwight D. Eisenhower at Supreme Headquarters, summarized the deteriorating situation in Normandy with stark clarity. In a memorandum to Eisenhower, he explained that the countryside south of the beaches had turned into a defensive labyrinth. Every pasture functioned like a fortified position, and each hedgerow concealed German strongpoints. The Allied forces, he observed, were fighting in conditions that resembled the static warfare of the First World War, except that instead of trenches cut into bare earth, the battlefield was covered in dense greenery. The terrain neutralized Allied strengths in speed, armor, and firepower. German commanders, he noted, were willingly giving up ground in exchange for inflicting heavy losses, and in that exchange they were gaining the advantage. German defensive methods in Normandy were both simple and highly effective. Rather than trying to maintain an unbroken front line, which would have demanded more troops than they possessed, German units dispersed small infantry groups throughout the bocage landscape. Soldiers in total, these men would occupy clusters of hedges arranged to create overlapping arcs of fire and mutually supporting positions. When American troops advanced, the defenders often waited until the attackers were fully exposed, moving through open ground between hedgerows. Only then would they unleash concentrated fire. German machine guns, especially the MG-42 with its extremely high rate of fire, could devastate advancing infantry in moments. American units would drop to cover, call for artillery, and attempt to locate the firing positions. By the time artillery began to land, however, German crews frequently had already withdrawn through concealed routes to alternate positions in the next hedgerow. The result was that American forces often attacked empty ground while new fire erupted from an unexpected direction. Defensive positions were constructed with meticulous care. Machine gun crews dug deeply into the earthen banks beneath hedges, sometimes creating tunnel-like shelters that protected them from shell bursts and hid them from view. Only a small opening, just large enough for a gun barrel, was left for firing, camouflaged with vegetation so thoroughly that it was nearly impossible to detect until it was used. From these concealed positions, German gunners could engage troops in the open with minimal exposure. Snipers also exploited the terrain, using trees that grew atop the hedges as observation points and targeting officers or non-commissioned officers to disrupt command and control. The loss of junior leaders had a disproportionate effect on American units. Companies that lost experienced sergeants and lieutenants early in the fighting became far less effective, even when replacements arrived. German units maintained strict discipline in concealment. Camouflage was constantly refreshed, vehicle tracks were hidden, and in some cases, flattened grass was carefully rearranged to avoid detection. They also dug connecting tunnels beneath hedgerows, allowing movement between positions without exposure. Some units went further, creating networks of trenches linking multiple hedges so that entire squads could shift positions unseen by Allied observers or reconnaissance aircraft. The psychological toll on American soldiers was severe. Many had already endured intense fighting during the landings, believing they had experienced the worst combat imaginable. Yet the bocage proved even more unsettling. On the beaches, enemy bunkers could at least be seen and targeted. In the hedgerows, fire often came from unseen positions. Every field might conceal an ambush, and each movement across open ground felt like stepping into a trap. Captain Joseph Ewing of the 175th Infantry Regiment later described the advance towards Saint-Lô as a slow movement through a maze of natural fortifications stretching for miles. Visibility was limited to one field at a time, and there was no reliable way to identify enemy positions until they opened fire. The constant tension wore men down quickly. Experienced soldiers became exhausted and shaken, while new replacements often broke under the strain within days. Amid this difficult situation, when casualties were mounting and progress was slow, an unexpected solution began to take shape. Curtis G. Culin III, a 29-year-old sergeant with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, would play a central role. Jersey National Guard. When mobilized, he trained as a tank driver and learned to operate and maintain Sherman tanks. Culin's background offered nothing that would have suggested he could solve a problem that had stymied senior military planners. What he possessed, however, was a practical, improvisational mindset shaped by the hardships of the Great Depression. Like many Americans of his generation, he was accustomed to repairing and adapting equipment with whatever materials were available. This habit of improvisation, valuing workable solutions over formal theory, proved crucial. In early July 1944, during a brief pause in operations, soldiers from Culin's unit informally discussed the difficulties posed by the hedgerows. Tank crews, infantrymen, and officers shared their frustrations and recounted losses suffered while trying to push through the dense barriers. Various ideas were proposed, most of them unrealistic. At one point, according to historian Max Hastings in Overlord, D-Day and the Battle for Normandy, 1984, a soldier from Tennessee suggested a solution that initially sounded absurd, perhaps the comment of someone exhausted by combat. Hastings identified the man only as Roberts, offering no further details about his identity or unit. Decades of investigation by military scholars have never uncovered a primary document that identifies this individual or even proves he was real. The entire story traces back to a single reference by Hastings, likely drawn from spoken recollections or unverified anecdotes. According to that account, an unnamed soldier once suggested something along the lines of attaching serrated blades to the front of a tank so it could slice through the thick hedgerows. One man in the group, however, did not dismiss it. Curtis Culin listened carefully and recognized a practical mechanical idea hidden beneath the crude suggestion. Tanks in Normandy could not simply climb over the hedges without exposing their vulnerable undersides, and they could not smash through the dense earthen embankments by brute force. But cutting through them might work. If steel blades could be driven into the base of a hedge, the tank's weight and engine power might slice through roots and soil the way a plow cuts into hard ground. Culin began analyzing the problem methodically. He imagined several steel prongs projecting from the tank's front. These would need to angle slightly downward so they would bite into the earthen bank at ground level, instead of riding up the obstacle's face. As the vehicle advanced, the prongs would sever roots and break through compacted earth, while the tank's own mass would keep it stable and prevent the dangerous upward tilt that exposed its belly armor. Vegetation and soil would be forced upward, but the tank itself would pass straight through at ground level. The concept was straightforward and technically feasible, provided suitable materials could be found. The necessary steel was available nearby. 6 weeks earlier, German engineers had covered the Normandy beaches with anti-landing obstacles intended to destroy Allied craft. Among them were the so-called Czech hedgehogs, 3 heavy steel I-beams welded together to form a 6-pointed barrier. After the invasion, thousands of these structures lay scattered along the coast. Many had been pushed aside, destroyed, or simply bypassed. When Culin presented rough drawings and explained how he planned to repurpose salvaged beams, his company commander quickly agreed. Within 2 days, he had access to a Sherman tank, welding equipment, and permission to retrieve steel from a salvage yard near Omaha Beach. Construction of the first prototype began in early July 1944 and took 3 days. Culin's team selected 4 I-beam sections about 5 feet long and weighing roughly 100 pounds each. They cut and shaped the front ends to form angled edges for better penetration. A crossbar held the prongs in position across the tank's front, and the entire assembly was welded to the lower front armor. The result was a simple but practical device, 4 heavy steel tusks extending forward and slightly downward, ready to be driven into a hedgerow. The modification added roughly 400 pounds to the tank, noticeable, but not enough to seriously affect performance. The prongs extended several feet beyond the tank's normal outline, requiring caution in tight spaces, but the potential benefit outweighed these drawbacks. The first field trial took place on July 11, 1944, in farmland a few miles inland from Omaha Beach. About 20 observers, mostly tank crewmen and officers, gathered to watch. Many expected another failed experiment. Numerous proposed solutions had already been tested, and most had proven ineffective. A tank with steel prongs welded to its front did not inspire confidence. Still, they were willing to witness the attempt. A representative hedgerow was chosen for the test, an earthen bank roughly 4 feet high, topped with dense, mature growth reaching about 15 feet. Oak trunks several inches thick were embedded in the hedge, typical of what American tank crews encountered daily across Normandy. If Culin's invention could overcome this particular hedge obstacle, it had the potential to clear most of the similar barriers across Normandy. The Sherman tank repositioned to gain momentum. Its driver, a corporal from Pennsylvania, whose identity was not documented, was understandably tense. The risk was severe. If the device malfunctioned or the tank became lodged on the hedger, as countless others had before, the crew could be killed. Yet he trusted Sergeant Curtis, who had carefully explained the mechanism and expressed confidence in its reliability. The tank engaged its gears, increased speed, and aimed straight at the barrier. At 5 to 10 miles per hour, the tank's prongs struck the hedge. There was an immediate, heavy tearing sound as steel sliced through soil and roots. The prongs anchored deeply into the ground. For a brief moment, the tank seemed to hesitate, resisting the obstacle's force. Then the engine's power surged, and with full throttle, the Sherman pressed forward. Soil erupted over the hull, branches broke, and tree trunks splintered. Within seconds, the tank emerged on the far side, intact, having cut through the barrier at ground level just as Culin had predicted. The witnessing soldiers responded with cheers, relief, and tears of hope. They had endured 6 weeks of failed attempts, helpless against terrain that repeatedly halted advances. Now, a straightforward, improvised device had provided a practical solution. Tank crews crowded around Culin, expressing gratitude, while officers immediately began assessing the broader tactical implications. Fatal on impact, the prongs gripped the earth and the tank drove through without exposing its underside. Breaching times averaged 5 to 8 seconds. News of Culin's device spread rapidly through the 2nd Armored Division. Within 3 days, Major General Edward Brooks, recognizing the potential to change the course of stalled operations, requested a formal demonstration for Lieutenant General Omar Bradley. Initially skeptical due to prior failed solutions, Bradley trusted his commanders and agreed to attend the next day, July 14, 1944. The demonstration involved 2 tanks, a light M5A1 Stuart and a medium Sherman, both equipped with the device. A representative hedgerow was selected, 5 feet high, with dense brush and mature trees, typical of obstacles that had stalled American advances for weeks. The Stuart led, accelerating directly at the hedge, tearing through the roots and earth in under 5 seconds. The Sherman followed, its greater mass forcing the barrier aside effortlessly. Bradley observed silently, Quickly grasping the strategic significance, a simple, reproducible device could finally enable armored advances through previously impassable terrain. The demonstration prompted immediate action. Bradley issued orders to begin mass production, aiming to equip as many tanks as possible before Operation Cobra, scheduled for July 25th. Lieutenant Colonel John Medorus, 1st Army Ordnance Officer, was tasked with overseeing the effort. Recognizing the emergency, Medorus implemented a rapid, flexible production system. Steel prongs were salvaged from destroyed German beach defenses, cut to size, beveled, and welded to tank hulls. There was no time for detailed planning. Every ordnance company, maintenance battalion, and repair depot followed immediate orders. Tanks from combat units arrived at these facilities for modification, waiting hours or overnight if necessary. Crews knew the device could save lives, having witnessed the deadly consequences of unmodified tanks failing against hedgerows. By mid-July, the modified tanks began returning to frontline units, ready to test their new capability under combat conditions. The feedback on the new devices was overwhelmingly favorable. Tanks equipped with the modifications performed precisely as intended, enabling them to cross hedgerows in seconds without exposing their vulnerable undersides. Tank commanders could navigate independently through the dense terrain, no longer constrained to roads or forced to search for small openings that German forces could defend. The increase in tactical options was significant. By July 20th, 5 days prior to the scheduled launch of Operation Cobra, roughly 300 tanks in the 1st Army had been fitted with Culin's devices, about 15% of American armored units in Normandy. General Omar Bradley sought to expand this coverage. Production was accelerated under Colonel Medorus, with additional ordnance teams redirected from other duties and welders taken from maintenance to focus solely on manufacturing the hedgerow cutting attachments. The effort became urgent, driven by the approaching operation. By July 24th, the day before Cobra's start, around 500 devices had been installed. This amounted to nearly 60% of the Sherman medium tanks, Stuart light tanks, and M10 tank destroyers slated for the assault. Menacing profile, earning them the nicknames Rhino tanks or rhinoceros tanks. The designation quickly spread through the American forces. Observing this innovation, British units adopted a similar concept, fabricating their own prongs from captured German beach obstacles. Although British production remained limited, by August some Sherman tanks in the British sector were similarly equipped. German forces encountering these modified tanks during Cobra had no standard term for them. Reports described American hedger tanks, tanks with steel horns, or simply modified Shermans. The sudden ability of American armor to traverse hedgerows neutralized German defensive assumptions and contributed to a rapid collapse of their positions. In the days leading up to Cobra, American forces conducted extensive preparations. Infantry rehearsed their attacks, artillery crews calibrated guns for predetermined targets, and Air Force officers coordinated close air support. Hundreds of tanks, newly outfitted with prongs, conducted final trials to train crews in hedgerow breaching techniques, ensuring that when the offensive began, armor could follow and exploit any infantry breakthrough. On July 25, 1944, at 0940 hours, the skies over Normandy were filled with the sound of heavy bombers. Over 1,500 B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators approached their designated bombing area northwest of St. Lo. Departing from England hours earlier, the bombers crossed the Channel, assembled into massive formations, and began releasing high-explosive and fragmentation bombs over a roughly 5-mile by 1.5-mile sector. German troops caught in the open were killed or injured, and survivors were stunned, disoriented, and unable to coordinate a coherent defense. Following the heavy bombers, roughly 1,000 medium bombers and fighter bombers dropped additional explosives and incendiaries. In total, about 3,300 tons of bombs fell across 12 square kilometers, averaging roughly 5,000 bombs per square kilometer. Precision proved difficult. Some ordnance fell short, striking American positions and causing tragic friendly fire casualties. Over 800 U.S. soldiers were killed or wounded, including Lieutenant General Leslie James McNair, the highest-ranking American officer to die in combat in Europe during World War II. Despite these losses, the bombing shattered German defenses. The Panzer-Lehr Division, an elite armored unit, was reduced to a fraction of its strength. Communications were cut, command posts destroyed, and surviving German soldiers were dazed, unable to effectively resist. At this point, American ground forces moved forward. The 7th Corps, under Major General J. Lawton Collins, spearheaded the attack. 3 veteran infantry divisions, the 4th on the right, the 9th in the center, and the 30th on the left, advanced through the devastated terrain, exploiting the disarray. Behind them, the 2nd Armor Division, Hell on Wheels, commanded by Major General Edward Brooks, and the 3rd Armor Division, the Spearhead, under Major General Leroy Watson, prepared to follow with the bulk of American tanks, trying to process the destruction around them, while others attempted to resist, but discovered their weapons buried under debris or their ammunition depleted. The command hierarchy had effectively collapsed. Officers trying to organize a defense could not reach higher headquarters or coordinate with neighboring units. On July 25th, the American advance pushed roughly 1 mile past the starting line, slower than planned, demonstrating that the bombing had not entirely eliminated German resistance. Even damaged hedgerows still offered some defensive advantage. American infantry were forced to clear each German-held field through intense close-range fighting. However, these were isolated acts of survival and courage rather than a coordinated, systematic defense. Observing the advance from a forward command post, Major General Collins noted that German opposition, while still dangerous, lacked cohesion. No counterattacks were organized, no structured defensive lines were being established, and units were effectively fighting alone. The German front was not holding, it was collapsing. Recognizing the opportunity, Collins made a decisive move on the afternoon of July 25th. He ordered 2 armored divisions to exploit the situation ahead of the original timetable. The initial plan had been for infantry to carve a wide corridor before tanks advanced, but Collins judged that waiting would allow German forces to regroup. By committing armor immediately, he aimed to capitalize on the chaos before enemy defenses could stabilize. At dawn on July 26th, Combat Command A of the 2nd Armored Division, led by Brigadier General Maurice Rose, spearheaded the armored advance from St. Lo. Rhino tanks breached hedgerows at will, bypassing strongpoints, exploiting gaps, and crossing terrain without following roads where German anti-tank weapons lay in wait. This mobility prevented the Germans from re-establishing defensive positions and had a devastating psychological effect. For weeks, German forces had relied on hedgerows to funnel attackers into kill zones and to anchor anti-tank defenses. Suddenly, American tanks were breaching obstacles that were considered impassable, rendering the carefully constructed defensive system obsolete in a single day. Counterattacks failed, and German infantry attempting to block the advance were bypassed and isolated. Anti-tank guns became ineffective as American armor emerged from unexpected directions, leaving officers unable to predict or respond to the assault. By midday, the leading elements of the 2nd Armored Division had advanced 6 miles, surpassing the progress of the entire 1st Army over the previous 2 weeks of slow fighting. Key towns and road junctions fell rapidly. Marigny, 6 kilometers south of the start line, was captured by infantry supported by armor, with large numbers of German reinforcements surrendering, often unguarded due to the lack of personnel. German diaries, such as that of a medical NCO named Clean, reflected the collapse of morale. Defenders spoke of survival rather than victory, of escape rather than defense. The momentum continued on July 27th. Despite previous friendly fire setbacks, the 30th Infantry Division reported that the front had opened wide. The 3rd Armored Division reached Coutances, 15 miles behind what had been the German line just 2 days earlier. German units attempting retreat found their paths cut by advancing tanks, leading to encirclement, surrender, or destruction. Full retreat, disorganized, and incapable of mounting coordinated defense. Analysis after Operation Cobra highlighted the decisive impact of Rhino tanks. Approximately 70% of successful hedgerow breaches were accomplished by tanks with hedgerow cutters, the rest requiring slower engineer support. Tank crews reported that the devices allowed passage through obstacles in under 10 seconds, a speed essential to maintaining momentum and preventing German repositioning. Losses among Rhino-equipped tanks were roughly 40% lower than standard tanks, as vulnerable underbelly armor was no longer exposed, rendering German anti-tank tactics ineffective. Strategically, Operation Cobra produced immediate and far-reaching effects. By July 31st, the 8th Corps captured Avranches, opening routes into Brittany and toward central France. The once static Normandy front collapsed, and German forces, unable to adapt to mobile armored attacks, were rapidly overwhelmed. On August 1, 1944, the 3rd United States Army was activated under Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., tasked with exploiting the breakthrough and advancing deep into France. In the summer of 1944, Allied forces under General Patton's Third Army advanced across France with unprecedented speed. They moved south toward Brittany to seize key ports and pushed eastward toward the Seine River to encircle remaining German units still resisting in Normandy. The Army's armored divisions often covered up to 50 miles in a single day, bypassing heavily defended positions and leaving isolated German detachments to be cleared by following infantry. The slow, attritional fighting that had marked the Normandy campaign from D-Day through late July was rapidly replaced by a fluid, mobile warfare in which American logistical strength, mobility, and air superiority were fully leveraged. Paris was liberated on August 25th, only a month after the launch of Operation Cobra, with General Charles de Gaulle leading French forces into the city as German resistance disintegrated. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of German soldiers were trapped in the Falaise pocket, and by mid-August the encirclement had destroyed the fighting capacity of several divisions. German tanks, artillery, and vehicles that managed to escape the pocket were subsequently destroyed by Allied fighter bombers during their retreat toward the Seine. The German army in France never regained its former strength after this decisive defeat. Amid these events, Sergeant Curtis Culin gained recognition for his contributions, receiving both military honors and media attention. General Omar Bradley personally recommended Culin for the Legion of Merit, citing his invention's critical role in restoring tactical mobility to American armored units during Operation Cobra and saving countless lives. News outlets, including Culin's hometown paper, the Cranford Citizen and Chronicle, featured stories portraying him as a resourceful citizen soldier whose ingenuity had turned the tide in Normandy. Despite the acclaim, Culin consistently credited the initial concept to a Tennessee soldier whose casual suggestion had inspired the device. Though Culin engineered, built, and demonstrated the working prototype to General Bradley, he sought to acknowledge this soldier, identified by historian Max Hastings only as Roberts. No additional records confirm Roberts' identity, rank, or unit, leaving his role shrouded in uncertainty. Historians have found no primary sources to corroborate his existence, suggesting the account may stem from oral history, memory lapses, or conflated sources. Both legs. It was evacuated under fire and eventually transferred to medical facilities in Belgium and England. Surgeons saved his life, but were forced to amputate his left leg. After returning to the United States in 1945, Culin married Bernice Enright and resettled in New York City, resuming civilian life and taking a position with Schenley Industries, a liquor distributor where he had worked before the war. He raised a family, lived quietly, and rarely discussed his wartime experiences or his contributions to the Allied victory. On January 10, 1961, President Dwight D. Eisenhower highlighted Culin's achievement while receiving the Hoover Medal from the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. Eisenhower recounted how a modest sergeant had devised a simple yet life-saving mechanism for tanks, emphasizing that innovation could come from any level of an organization and that practical solutions from ordinary individuals could significantly impact outcomes. Curtis "Grub" Culin III passed away on November 20, 1963, in Greenwich Village, Manhattan, at the age of 48. Historical records do not provide details regarding the cause of his death. Curtis Culin was laid to rest with full military honors at Fairview Cemetery in Westfield, New Jersey, close to his hometown of Cranford. A veteran of the 102nd Cavalry Group, he had received the Legion of Merit, the Purple Heart, and multiple other commendations. His improvised invention, the hedgerow cutter, played a pivotal role in overcoming the prolonged stalemate in Normandy, significantly aiding the Allied advance in France. In recognition of his contribution, a memorial plaque was later installed on a boulder outside the Cranford Municipal Building, honoring his service and ingenuity. The hedgerow cutter, commonly called the Rhino device, continued to be used by U.S. armored units throughout the European campaign, although its tactical necessity declined as Allied forces moved beyond the dense Normandy hedgerows into the more open terrain of central and eastern France. Nevertheless, tanks equipped with the device participated in the liberation of Paris, the rapid advance across France, and even winter operations in Germany. The steel prongs that made the device effective in Normandy proved less useful elsewhere, but their impact in the hedgerow fields was decisive. Observing the success of the American tanks, British forces quickly adapted the idea, creating their own versions from captured German obstacles. By August 1944, they had produced hundreds of prongs, which were installed on Sherman tanks in British and Canadian units. Production continued through the fall, extending to other vehicles such as M10 tank destroyers, Cromwell tanks, and even some Churchill tanks. Despite differences in hull design, Culin's innovation has become a classic example of battlefield creativity and organizational flexibility, regularly studied at military schools and staff colleges. Several enduring lessons emerge from his story. First, it highlights the importance of military cultures that encourage ideas from all ranks. Culin, a sergeant with no formal engineering background, saw a solution to a tactical problem and was supported by his superiors, allowing the idea to reach higher command. Second, it demonstrates the value of practical problem-solving over formal training when facing unforeseen challenges. General Omar Bradley authorized mass production within 2 weeks, mobilizing all American ordnance units, transforming Culin's improvised idea into a force-wide capability. In contrast, a more bureaucratic military system might have delayed deployment for months, diminishing its tactical impact. The Normandy hedgerows themselves remain a case study in intelligence limitations. Although aerial photography had documented the terrain, planners failed to consider how tanks would navigate the densely enclosed fields. This oversight nearly stalled the invasion, resulting in high casualties during the first 6 weeks of inland fighting. Soldiers faced grueling conditions, often attacking seemingly impregnable positions and suffering heavy losses. Yet they adapted tactics, learned from experience, and leveraged innovations like the Rhino cutters to break the deadlock. The eventual breakout from Normandy in July and August 1944 set the stage for the rapid Allied advance across Western Europe. From the beaches of Normandy to the German border, Allied forces liberated France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and parts of the Netherlands. German defenses that had held in the hedgerows were overwhelmed, resulting in the destruction of divisions, abandonment of equipment, and the collapse of combat power in the West. This momentum, combined with Soviet advances from the East and strategic bombing of German industry, contributed directly to Nazi Germany's defeat in May 1945. The story of Curtis Culin illustrates the extraordinary impact of individual initiative supported by responsive leadership. His welded steel prongs, seemingly simple, solved a critical tactical problem, enabling Allied forces to overcome entrenched German defenses and advance toward victory. The Rhino tanks and their creator exemplify how straightforward, well-applied solutions can decisively influence the course of history, proving that innovation at the individual level, when recognized and implemented swiftly, can change the outcome of a global conflict.